Today we're looking at the sequel to How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, How to Color Comics the Marvel Way, with Marvel Age. Hey comic freaks, and welcome back to Dangerous Comics. I'm your host Dane Georges, and today we're looking at Marvel Age number 13, which features an article about how to color comics the Marvel way. And what's interesting about that is that's not something that's actually covered anywhere in How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, which I think is a really big oversight. It's something that's very interesting. I think back in the 60s and 70s, it was a little bit more overlooked and more seen as something that the printer or just someone in production was handling. So I think it's really cool that this issue of Marvel Age really gives it its own shine. Now, Marvel Age was an official Marvel news magazine. It was kind of like a fanzine, but officially put out by Marvel, and would have articles about writers, artists currently in the Marvel bullpen, about what was coming up, or it would feature articles like this. Here we have a cover article about Dreadstar, an overview of Jim Starlin's cosmic Marvel Comics career. Man, and I love that pose that he's doing with that little sword, how it kind of interacts with the logo. And what really grabbed me when I found this in the bin when I was flipping through comics was this How to Color Comics the Marvel Way. And I had to check out what that article was going to be like, because I've never really heard it talked about from this era what the process actually was for coloring comics. And this comes out at a really interesting time, kind of right at the crossover of when coloring was about to change. This is coming out in 1984, but we start with all of the Marvel coming attractions, just what's going on in the world. It's very interesting to see, what comics were looking like in 1984. We have a panel here of Walt Simonson's Thor, some Iceman and Angel, some G.I. Joe. So I really can see what was popular at that time. Some news watch about Power Pack, some of the new Hulk creative. Also, something to note is all of the copyright here of 1983 Marvel Comics Group. That will become significant, especially in this Jim Starlin interview. The copyright actually belongs to James P. Starlin. So another thing is seeing Marvel move into a little bit more of the creator-owned world with their Epic line, meaning that Jim Starlin actually owned that copyright, and this was his original work. Something that Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, and all those artists never had an opportunity to do before. And this is a really fun article. I've never read Dreadstar. I've read some of the other Jim Starlin books. Really got me interested in checking it out, but it charts a really fun journey of Jim Starlin's career in comics at Marvel. Looking at his work from Captain Marvel to Adam Warlock, the death of Captain Marvel, and then into the Metamorphosis Odyssey and the Dreadstar universe, and really just highlighting how much Jim Starlin prefers to work on his own creator-owned projects where he can build a complete history and world and isn't reliant on what came before. This article is written by Mark Lear, and something that's interesting is that he calls out the 70s generation of comic artists as the avant-garde generation. He's grouping Jim Starlin, Walt Simonson, Al Milgrom, and Bernie Wrightson, artists that are trying different things and bringing a little bit of a different visual style than the artists before them. Next is Marvel Age 1961 by Warren Reese, highlighting the pre-Marvel monster universe before the Fantastic Four broke onto the scene, and really outlines how many of the ideas used in these early Marvel monster stories would later be reused in the traditional Marvel superhero stories, tracking where that came from and then how it was implemented in kind of a different kind of atomic superhero story. Talking about how they used a lot of the same kind of monster titles like Groot or the Hulk. In this final paragraph, he says, however, the special ingredient was the Lee Kirby characterization. The members of the Fantastic Four behaved like real people who were suddenly plunged into the larger-than-life roles. It was this brand of characterization that became a hallmark of the Marvel Age of comics. Next, we have an article about Conan by Bob Sodaro and Mark Lear. And this is all about the 3 different Conan titles that were being published at the time. I am not a huge Conan buff, but really interesting how they work balancing these 3 titles and just how popular Conan was at the time to warrant 3 titles. Today, you definitely see a character like Spider-Man, Batman, or Superman having like 3 spin-off titles because it can garner enough interest. But really interesting that at that time, Conan was at that same level of popularity, definitely due to the artists and writers on the book and just the history of the pulps that he was bringing over. And those 3 titles were Conan, which was Conan adventuring in his 20s before ruling, Conan the King, which was Conan in his 50s ruling with his children before he steps down, and then The Savage Sword of Conan, which was a black and white magazine with more adult stories because they could get around using the comic code since it was a magazine. There were some really amazing artists on Conan. Barry Windsor Smith, Mark Silvestri, definitely has a really good history. Let me know if this is one of your favorite eras of Marvel Comics and which of those 3 Conan titles was your favorite. And before we get to the star of the show, How to Color Comics the Marvel Way, let's get a quick word from our sponsor, me. I'm a self-published cartoonist, and you can find all my work at danegeorges.com, which I have linked in the description below. There you'll find a variety of my comics like Doomskull or X-Ray, a collection of my webcomics, not to mention a wide variety of zines like The Passenger, Jigglypuff, Sleepless Sights, and I'm super excited to announce that I finally have finished Doomskull number 4. Look at that beautiful, vibrant green cover. This is a super fun issue about a baby getting lost in the grocery store, and Doomskull and Bag Boy have to go save him from certain doom. But super proud of how this issue turned out. I'd really appreciate if you would check it out on my website and order a copy. But there's other ways to support me besides just buying my comics. You also can like this video, subscribe, or share this video with a comic-loving friend in your life. Every view means so much to me, and I really appreciate the community of comic freaks that we're building together. So thank you so much for watching. Also consider becoming a member of the channel. If you do, you'll help me make more comics and episodes, and you'll get episodes early. Without further ado, let's get back to the episode. And we finally get to the reason you're all here, How to Color Comics the Marvel Way. It's a pretty dense article, so I'm going to jump on in. This is also written by Mark Learer, and we start off by talking about just how color really commands attention, really draws the reader in, and highlighted that this Marvel age, or just in general with the letters columns for comics, actually got a lot of people requesting to know, how does Marvel do their coloring? And so that inspired them to maybe we should write an article about it. And Mark is saying, indeed, no matter what part of the comic field you're interested in, you'll benefit from knowing the principles of good coloring. Marie Severin, who has mastered nearly every aspect of the medium, strongly recommends that every writer, penciler, or inker color at least once. Furthermore, the recent technical breakthroughs of printing on high-quality paper and printing in full-process color makes the colorist's job more exciting and more important than ever. There's no one place you can go to learn how to color comics. The demands of the craft are unique, so the only real way to learn coloring is to do it. Almost all of our colorists are experienced artists in more than one medium. Many have penciling and inking experience behind them. And he also highlights that many of these colorists actually were more than just production people or having inking or penciling experience. They actually knew how to paint, and they knew how to work with a brush. And that was really important for this era of coloring. Because we're going to get into this next section that talks about tools, materials, and the color chart. And what's super cool about this article is that if we flip the page, a color chart of all the 64 colors that Marvel had available for coloring is actually included. And so we can see here how this coloring breakdown worked. We have 4 different groupings, and we see how the first one has no yellow included. The next one has 25% yellow included, 50, and then 100%. And we can see all these color variations that you get with mixtures of red, blue, and yellow. And traditional printing is a 4-color printing process. That's C, M, Y, and K, K being black. And that would be that final layer that would lay on top. So they're not really mixing black into any of these colors yet. And above we get an illustration of the tools that we're going to be talking about. Kind of similar to how to Draw Comics the Marvel Way included an illustration of all the tools that you would use to ink, pencil, and letter a comic. And what this is really outlining is how important these kind of letter breakdowns were for the colorist. So you see these combinations of letters would let the printer know what color you're trying to use. So a no red 25% blue would be B2, and then 50% blue no red would be B3, and 100% blue being B. And then you can kind of see how that builds upon as you add other colors with Y2B, Y3B, YB. And with that knowledge, we kind of start to understand how colorists would call out these colors for the printer. You see here, he's saying comic books are printed in 64 color combinations of red, blue, yellow, and their lighter shades shown here on the printer color chart. The notion may be a little confusing. R means a solid, or 100% screen of red. Likewise, B means 100% screen of blue, and Y means 100% screen of yellow. What is really interesting is that the colorist is not able to just take this chart and, cut it out and put it where it needs to be. The colorist is actually using this collection of doc Martin dyes to mix the colors. So a colorist had to be really good with their color palette and how they would mix colors to try to replicate these colors exactly. So if they want a Y3, R3, B2, they would have to mix these colors with the Doc Martin dyes themselves. And in doing so, they would then color on a Xerox reprint of the artwork. So they're basically using this chart to make color guides that they would paint over and then give to the printer. And what the article is actually calling out is that sometimes these colors would be so difficult to mix. The green of Dr. Doom's cloak or the gray of his suit of armor were actually hard colors to mix, and it was hard to get them perfect to the chart that it was easier for a colorist to just try to get it close enough with the mixture and then just mark the number they wanted on the Xerox. You'll also see this in like animation when they're calling out what colors they want people to use. A lot of times you'll see a drawing and they'll just have an arrow to it telling it what color that actually is. Next, we get a breakdown of how some coloring would be applied to this Captain America drawing. Mark is saying, let's try coloring a few characters. Captain America's costume is easy. His colors are YRB and white. White being the pure white of the page. You're basically just telling the printer, don't use a color at all. Just, it's going to be blank and then the white of the page will come through. YR comes straight out of the bottle, marked vermilion. And B, you already know, comes straight out of the bottle of cerulean blue. White, of course, you just leave blank. The Hulk is a little harder. His skin is YB2 and his pants are RB2. RB2 comes straight out of the bottle labeled magenta. The best way to get YB2 is to mix Niles green with a little bit of lemon yellow. Man, that's so much work just to mix these colors just for a guide and just to get them so exact that the printer would actually know what they're looking at. But you can definitely see what they're saying about why it would be so important that these colorists are actually artists, that they would know how to mix these colors. And then in mixing, they are kind of painting this Xerox and they are finding contrasting colors and working in this very limited palette of 64 colors to try to tell the story in a very dynamic and clear way. They also highlight here that there's not one single way to color comics. Here Jim Starlin is referenced in how comics used to be colored, that heroes were always 100% primary colors, villains all secondary colors, civilians all dark blue and brown, and backgrounds would be pastel 25% or 50% shades. So you can kind of see where that classification would have come from, just dividing up this palette and be like, these are restricted for the good guys, these are the bad guys. Let's make it really simple and really clear. If you just look at them, you can get an idea of what side they're on. They also speak about how the first goal is always clarity. Consider the planes, that's foreground, middle, and background, and don't color every element. They talk about how a beginner's mistake might be to color every doorknob or every book on a bookshelf, and how you can really be a little bit more reserved and just color the background as one color and just kind of leave that focus on the characters. This is a good example of that foreground, background, middle ground here. We see how the foreground is all this kind of blue-purple. The middle ground, the characters are colored a little bit more true to their actual colors. We have Kurt Connors here in a orange jumpsuit, really stands out, and then the background is mostly the trees where we get green and a little bit of brown for the tree trunks. But you can see how that method of thinking works. So they're really warning people about over-rendering. You don't need to, render every shadow or give everything a different color. They're really trying to keep it simple, just to prioritize clarity on this kind of newsprint printing. They do call out later about how you can make a highlight panel to try to bring that emotion, but they're saying to use it sparingly. I don't always agree with sky should be blue, so let's color it blue. I think you can give a little bit of drama and storytelling in the color in there as well. And they talk about some more production stuff here. People always ask us how we manage sometimes to print a figure's outline in a color other than black. It's done by means of something called an overlay. The lines to be printed in color are inked in black on a clear acetate sheet attached to the page of artwork. It's not really a colorist's prerogative to decide when to use an overlay. That's generally a decision of a penciler or inker. Often, though, the penciler and inker will consult with the colorist to decide what color the overlay should be printed in. An imaginative color choice can make the overlay very effective. Obviously, in today's world of coloring comics, color holds are way more common, and they're not always the choice of the inker or penciler. Often that is the colorist's decision now of how they want to break down that scene, and maybe that also helps them define that foreground, background, middle ground. And we move into coloring on high-quality paper. Baxter, Hudson, and Mando stocks are much wider than regular paper. Colors look especially vibrant when printed on Baxter paper. The colorist must adjust his palette accordingly. Too many bright, solid colors can overpower the reader and cause the story to lose clarity. So for example, if you're coloring a story for Baxter paper that would ordinarily call for a lot of 100% yellow, you'll want to tone it down to a 50% yellow in many places. One wonderful thing about coloring for Baxter paper is that the screens used in the printing process are finer, so colors print more accurately. You can use many of the grays, browns, and pastels that don't print well on regular paper. You can color graduated background tones too. And so this is something that's super apparent in a lot of reprints nowadays. A lot of reprints of older comics are printed on whiter paper, right? They're printed on a more common stock that's used today. And because of that, a lot of the colors look garish and ugly. They are using the old color palette. They're pulling from the old files. So they are using 100% yellow on that white paper, 100% red. And it looks too bright. It's not how the colorist wanted it to look. The colorist knew that color was going to sink and absorb into the paper and become part of the paper and kind of use the tone of the paper to mute it a bit. So that's why it's such a shame when these older comics aren't given the proper attention they need to have their color palette adjusted for this newer paper stock to make it look more accurate to what it looked like originally and just not so garish and ugly. Here we also get a cool page of looking at all the potentials of coloring this new character, Red Wolf. They're leaning into those primary colors, so I think we can assume this is a hero. But very interesting, and we see what the final version is compared to all the others. And next we're outlining, there are challenges for colorists as we move into this new world with different paper stock. We're still learning the idiosyncrasies of whiter paper, and many of the freedoms and limitations they present are not known. Next, we highlight covers and how important that cover is just to bring you in. They use brighter colors. They also, covers typically, you can see here even compared to the two paper stocks, covers are already a whiter, little bit glossier paper stock than the interior newsprint. So we see how these colors really do print brighter. Look how vibrant that Marvel Age cover is with that pure, solid background. It does really pop. You can see how they're really using colors differently on a cover than you would on interiors to really draw the reader's eye. And this section really talks about how the cover is one of the most important images in an entire comic because it's what really captures the reader's imagination and makes them want to pick it up off the stand. They also speak about how you can use a little bit of a wider color range there, and you don't maybe always need to typically color things the way they're supposed to be, and you can lean into some different colors that would be more eye-catching for the reader. Next, we move into full process color. Entirely different from regular 64 color printing, full process color is fairly recent development in comics. In full process coloring, the colorist paints a finished piece, which is photographically reproduced for the final comic book. This method is also called coloring for reproduction, because the mark of the colorist's hand will be reproduced exactly in the comic. You've seen full process color in Epic Illustrated, the Marvel graphic novels, our special edition reprint books, and many covers for our regular line of comics. And so with full process coloring and this wider paper stock that Marvel's moving into and the industry as a whole is moving toward in the 80s, you really see how coloring is about to take this leap into a whole new art form and how it's totally being relooked at as actual art that's being incorporated and not just this piece of production. Probably the artist that gets the most credit for some of this full process coloring is Lynn Varley on Frank Miller's work of The Dark Knight Returns. And a lot of that coloring work was done blue line method where the artwork would be reproduced on an acetate overlay and then the colors would actually be on a piece of Bristol board with blue line indications of where the artwork is, and the colorist would paint the actual background, which then would be photographed and used in the background. So the printing process as a whole is taking huge leaps and bounds here to really change what can be done on the printed page and how much detail you can really put in there and still have it reproduced nicely. When working full process, a colorist colors not on a Xerox, but on a full-sized photostat of the black and white artwork. You can more fully explore the range of colors that Dr. Martin dyes give you. So some colorists were still using Doc Marten dyes. Others were using watercolors, markers. It really opened it up to whatever a colorist was most comfortable with and whatever their artistic interpretation was and what they thought would bring that specific mood and proper coloring and storytelling to the story. It really becomes more a part of the art. And we see a little bit of what some other artists are working on. We see that Bob Sharon likes to use fine point magic markers. For the New Mutants graphic novel, Glynis Wein did a good deal of highlighting in tempera paint. Christy Steele, frustrated by the Dr. Marten dyes, used opaque acrylic paints for the gray and purple in the second issue of Doctor Strange Special Edition. And it is a bit of trial and error. It's a little bit of trying something on the page, getting it printed, and then seeing what the results are in print, and then adjusting from there. And in our closing remarks, we've just talked about how everything's advancing, everything's changing, but still at that very center of coloring, regardless of the medium or how you're actually creating those colors on the page, what's most important is clarity. Also talk about down here that really, besides all the technical things, if you do get a crack at a pro job, be dependable. The proficient and reliable colorists have no problem getting work on a regular basis. Remember too, though, that it takes years to build up the reputation of a Marie Severin or Glynis Wein. Give it your best shot, because we're always open to new talent, and you may find some hard work and determination that you can become a Marvel Comics colorist. And then they direct you to check out the Marvel Official Comics Tryout book, which is a fun plug. And on this last page, I love that they've chosen to give some shine to some of these unsung heroes of Marvel Comics, these awesome colorists. And we have a nice bio for everyone, too. We have Paul Becton, George Roussos, Christy Sheely, Marie Severin, who, man, she is such a hero of comic coloring from the EC Comics to Marvel. Really need to do an episode all about her and her work at Marvel. And a lot of these colorists were women that worked in the bullpen, and they really do not get enough praise or shine for all they contributed to comics. We see in her bio working on the Submariner, Not Brand Ek, Crazy, Tales from the Crypt, man, has such a great portfolio of work behind her, and she really was such a trailblazer for the industry. We also have Bob Sharon, Glynis Wein, and Andy Yonkis. And we end this Marvel Age with some ads. We've got Secret Wars is coming, kind of giving us an idea of where Marvel is headed. This is such a cool issue of Marvel Age. I love that we're highlighting how to color comics the Marvel way. Also get an ad on the back here for Epic Illustrated. And this is kind of a snapshot of coloring at a certain time. If you're interested in getting into coloring, I don't know how helpful this is to you today, right? Because in the current comic process, they're no longer mixing dyes to make color guides for printers. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about how to color comics currently in a more digital age, I would highly suggest checking out the DC Guide to Coloring and Lettering Comics by Mark Chiarello and Todd Klein. Although Photoshop has updated quite a bit since this was printed, the techniques that it's highlighting and telling you about have not. And although the layout of Photoshop might look different, you still can use this to learn those foundations. It tells you how to scan in art, how you're supposed to set up your files, and it also does that with digital lettering as well. So although some of the programs and just kind of general layouts might be different, you really can learn a lot. This book really was foundational for me. Even in 2025, this book is extremely helpful if you are really interested in learning how to digitally color your comics. So just wanted to highlight that along with this issue of Marvel Age, because this book was extremely important to me learning how to color comics and how to color my own work. And I love kind of contrasting these two of where we were to where we've grown in comics and how production used to be done and how it's still really not that different. A lot of the fundamentals are still there. We're just doing it in this new digital age. And maybe we don't have to do color guides anymore, but still the fundamentals are there about keeping it clear, keeping it simple, and making sure that storytelling is at the very center of your comic. But thank you so much for watching and checking out this episode for me. It really means a lot to me if you've stuck around and watched this long into the episode. Thank you so much. Thanks for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing or becoming a member of the channel. By becoming a member, you'll help me make more comics and more episodes. And bonus for you, you get episodes early, so it's a win-win. Once again, thank you so much. All you comic freaks are the absolute best. But until I see you here next time, remember to think and read dangerously. See ya.